Joining us now, Ashley Parker, Washington Post senior national political correspondent and an MSNBC political analyst. Back with us, David Jolly. Also joining us, NBC's Dasha Burns here in the studio. You were there. I'm going to pull back the curtain a little. You were telling me you were flying in from Florida. You were tired. You've done a lot of Trump rallies, but it was really interesting, and you're glad you went.
Yeah, I am glad I went, because working that crowd and talking to the people that showed up was really illuminating, Chris. I mean, you talked and played those comments from him on immigration, right? I met a lot of immigrants at that rally. Actually, a lot of folks from the Dominican Republic, that's a big demographic in the Bronx, who themselves agree with Trump's hardline stance on immigration. They said things to me like, look, I came here, quote, the right way, and I'm frustrated by what I see at the border. I'm frustrated by what I see in New York City in terms of how those migrants are getting taken care of when I feel like I haven't been taken care of like this in this city. And number one, for all of these voters, Black, Hispanic, white, Jewish, all were there in that crowd. Not surprising, a reflection of what we're seeing in the polling, the economy, those pocketbook issues, number one. Take a listen to some of my conversations.
Now we're becoming the Bronx second-class citizens. We have this influx of migrants that are coming in, and they're getting everything. And everyone in the Bronx, in the city of New York, is forgotten.
The Bronx has a lot of crime. A lot of migrants are here, and it's just getting out of control.
When I came and he was the president, the gas was a lot cheaper than it is right now. I used to work in a supermarket. I was a manager. I saw the prices in food go up as soon as he left the presidency. So I want that back.
I had a lot of off-camera conversations too, Chris, with folks who were like, hey, I don't want to get judged by people in my community, but I do support former President Trump. A lot of people I met, their first time at a Trump event, their first time they're planning to vote for Trump, the first time they're going to vote for a Republican for president, a lot of first-time voters, period.
But so one of the other things he said, without any evidence at all, is migrants are coming to the U.S., they're building an army to launch an attack of some. I mean, when he goes to that extreme without any evidence whatsoever, that's not what lands.
So what I'll tell you is I asked voters about similar things he said in the past. I asked him about his position on the Central Park Five. I asked him about some of his comments that have appealed to white supremacists, right? What voters say is that this is just how he talks. We don't like it. Some of it's a bit offensive, but I look at what my life was like during the Trump administration versus now, and I liked it better then. And this is something I've heard consistently as I continue to bring up some of what he said that is really striking, is historic, might be offensive to people. They're looking past that.
You know, Ashley, the Biden campaign ahead of that rally said in an X post, let's remember, Trump is a lifelong racist, from calling to execute innocent Black teenagers to standing with violent white supremacists. We all know who Trump is. But when you listen to the folks that Dasha's talking to, they know who Trump is, and they're willing to put aside that part of it that some people, again, may find offensive, in favor of what they believe is a better economic future and a whole range of things. I wonder what you think the strategy is here on both sides.
Well, it's striking that the Biden campaign is even up, with that ad and with these messages, trying to remind Black voters, Hispanic voters that they say, as they say, Trump is a racist. Because that's typically not something a Democratic president wants to have to worry about, right? A Democratic president typically wins in part of a huge base that is more diverse, includes a lot of Black voters, a lot of Hispanic voters. You win those swing states by turning out those sorts of voters in cities. Trump is likely to win the more rural parts of the states. So the fact that the Biden campaign is right now not just focused on sort of turning them out, but trying to first, before they can turn them out for Biden, convince them that, hey, wait a minute, you shouldn't like this guy Trump, is a sign of what the polls show, which is that Trump is making inroads with these voters. And it's not necessarily that he's going to win them or win them all, but in an election that people expect, like last election, to be decided in, 3 swing states by 30 or 40,000 voters, President Biden cannot afford to have Trump really make any inroads in these communities that used to be considered a stalwart part of the Democratic base.
Yeah, David, to go back to the whole idea of that small group of Americans who will decide this election, Trump also worked a very familiar theme for him, that nothing that is bad in the world would have happened or would happen if he were president, including the hostages being held by Hamas.
Many of the hostages that you're waiting for and everybody's waiting for, those hostages, many of them are dead. Many of them are dead. And it's a horrible thing. It's a horrible thing, but many of those hostages are dead. Some will be alive, but many of those hostages are dead. It's a very serious, horrible thing. It would have never happened if the election weren't rigged.
So he's made that claim before, but at some point, my question is, will those truly undecided voters look for actual policy discussions or proposed solutions, or will simply saying it wouldn't have happened if I were president work with disaffected voters?
So Hamas pre-existed Donald Trump, and it'll be there long after Donald Trump. And I think what he said is quite the embellishment, if not a lie. What we also know from polling is that the vast majority of voters are not going to decide who they vote for based on the current conditions in the Middle East. But what Donald Trump continues to have in his favor is global unrest counts against the incumbent. And so he is going to argue that that inflation is too high. He will misrepresent economic numbers, and he will talk about war on the world stage. Now, how would he handle it differently? He would greenlight Netanyahu to do whatever he wanted. The whole conversation right now about whether or not the strategy by Israel is approaching human rights violations or has crossed that line, Donald Trump would ignore it, and he would likely hand Ukraine to Vladimir Putin. And that is the way he would suggest bringing peace on the world stage. I don't think that's where the heartbeat of the country is on many of those issues. But Donald Trump, as a candidate against a sitting incumbent, gets to run against the current state of affairs, and he sees value in that. What he often skips over is that he was president for 4 years. From the migrant crisis to Vladimir Putin marching across the world stage, also was contributed to by his 4 years in office.
So, Ashley, Trump, again, a familiar theme, praising authoritarian leaders during the rally, and I want to play just a very small bit of that.
When you see President Xi of China, when you see Kim Jong-un of North Korea, when you see Putin, and you see all of these people, they're at the top of their game, whether you like it or not.
You covered the Trump White House. You know Donald Trump. Where is this landing for him, and what's the danger in it?
Politically, or, it's a couple of things. There's the issue of this is who Donald Trump is at his core. He came into office not really understanding the federal government, the presidency. He expected to be a monarch, right? And early on, he was frustrated that the president doesn't have sort of divine rights. Things have to go through Congress. You can have a majority and still get thwarted. And he's long admired these strongmen. It's who he is. It's what he believes. And it's interesting. It's a fine line he has to walk, because so far he has not paid a tremendous penalty for comments like these. But there has been language that goes beyond this, where it feels like language from Nazi Germany that he's used. And that is where his campaign is sensitive. And that is where he might overstep and pay a penalty with voters.